He found her wedged between the rocks at the bottom of a canyon, beaten, starved, and branded like cattle. A letter C burned into her arm with a hot iron. She was Apache. She was a fugitive. And she had just killed a man to escape a mine where 22 women and children were still chained in the dark. The moment he reached for her, she bit through his hand and drove a sharpened bone pin at his chest. She didn't want his help. She'd learned that when white men show kindness, shackles always follow. But here's what she didn't know about the cowboy kneeling in the dust beside her. 3 years ago, he drove a sealed wagon to that same mine. He never asked what was inside. He took the $20 and crawled back into his bottle. And months later, when he found a dead child on the trail bearing the same brand now seared into her flesh, he rode on. He did nothing. Now the woman paying the price for his silence is bleeding in his bed. And the man who branded her? He just posted a $200 bounty on her head. Every gun in the territory is coming. And the only man standing between her and death is the one who helped put her there. You're listening to Cowboy Dusk, where the desert speaks. The silence runs deep, and every story carries the dust of the frontier on its boots. If you're drawn to tales of redemption, unlikely love, and souls forged in fire under a western sky, ride with us. This story teaches us that looking away from injustice doesn't make us innocent. It makes us part of it. And that redemption isn't a single moment of heroism. It's the daily choice to stop running from who we were and start becoming who we should have been all along. If this story gripped you from the first word, hit that like button and tell me in the comments. What would you have done if you found her in those rocks? Share this with someone who believes that broken people can still do extraordinary things. And subscribe to Cowboy Dusk so the next story finds you before the sun goes down. Daniel Hayes had not fired his gun in 3 years. Tonight, his hand found the grip without permission. He sat alone in his cabin at the edge of the canyon, the last copper light of evening sliding through the window and falling across the table where a half-empty bottle of whiskey stood like an old friend who never left. The glass in his hand was warm. The liquor burned going down, but not enough. It never burned enough to kill the memory. 3 years ago, on a dirt road outside of Las Cruces, he had chased a boy through the dark. Deputy United States Marshal Daniel Hayes, 29 years old, running hard after a shape that moved too fast and turned too quick. The boy spun around in the moonlight. His hand came up holding something dark and solid. Daniel fired. One shot. Center, mass. The sound cracked the night open like a broken plate. The boy hit the ground and did not move. Daniel walked forward with his revolver still raised, his breath coming in ragged pulls. He looked down. The boy was maybe 14, 15 at the most, Mexican kid, thin as a fence post. His hand was still wrapped around the thing he had drawn. Daniel pried it loose and held it up in the moonlight. A wooden toy gun, carved and painted black, the kind a boy might carry to feel brave in a world that gave him nothing to feel brave about. Daniel stood there in the dirt road holding that toy gun while the boy bled out at his feet, and something inside him cracked clean through. He could still hear the sound, not the gunshot, the silence after. The silence that followed him across 3 states and 2 years of whiskey and ended here, in a one-room cabin in the Arizona Territory, where the nearest human being was a one-legged shopkeeper in a town called Copper Bluff, 12 miles south. He poured another drink. The bottle was getting light. He thought about the courtroom where a judge told him he was cleared. He thought about the boy's mother screaming in Spanish from the gallery. He thought about the badge he dropped on his captain's desk without a word. He thought about all of it until the thinking became a kind of drowning. And then he put the bottle down and walked outside because the walls were too close and the air was too still. And if he sat there one more minute, he was going to start talking to ghosts. He saddled his horse in the fading light and rode out along the canyon rim. The desert evening was quiet. The wind moved slow and warm across the rock, carrying the smell of dust and sage and something distant that might have been rain. Daniel let the horse set the pace, content to drift, letting the motion of the animal underneath him replace the motion of his thoughts. The trail wound between dry boulders and clusters of mesquite, dropping slowly toward the canyon floor, where the shadows pooled like dark water. His horse stopped. Daniel did not pull the reins. The animal stopped on its own, ears pricked forward, nostrils flared. Something ahead. Daniel narrowed his eyes and scanned the rocks below the ridge. At first he saw nothing. Then a smear of color against the pale stone caught his attention. Dark red, almost black in the fading light. He dismounted and walked to the edge. Blood on the rocks, not animal blood. The trail led down between two jagged boulders and disappeared into a narrow gap. Daniel loosened his revolver in its holster and followed the trail down, his boots crunching on loose gravel. The blood was recent, still tacky in places. Whoever left it was close. He found her wedged between the stones at the bottom of the slope, half hidden in shadow. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth caught on the rocks. Then the bundle moved and he saw the outline of a body. A woman, young, dark hair tangled with dust and dried blood. Her skin was brown, her features sharp. Apache, he guessed. Maybe Chiricahua, judging by the shell beadwork still clinging to her torn collar. She was in bad shape. Her clothes were ripped nearly to rags. Bruises covered her arms and face, layered in colors that told him the beatings had gone on for weeks, not days. Her wrists bore deep grooves where rope had cut into the flesh until it scarred. She was thin, the kind of thin that comes from being fed just enough to work and not enough to fight. Then Daniel saw the brand. On her left forearm, seared into the flesh in a raised scar of puckered skin, was a letter, a stylized C, burned deep, the edges still angry and red beneath the dirt. His stomach dropped through his boots. He had seen that mark before. 2 years ago, riding back from a hunt in the hills north of Copper Bluff, he had found a boy dead beside the trail. Native kid, small, maybe 10 years old. His body was thin and his feet were bare, and his left arm bore the same burned letter. A C seared into the skin like a brand on cattle. Daniel had been drunk that day. He had looked at the dead boy, felt something cold move through his chest, and told himself it was someone else's problem. He remounted his horse and rode home. He did not report it. He did not tell anyone except Tom Ludlow weeks later, when the whiskey loosened his tongue. And Tom had gone pale and quiet and said something Daniel did not want to hear. "That wagon you hauled for Crane. When you first got here, that sealed wagon you drove from the border to the mine." Daniel had not asked what was inside that wagon. He had needed the money, $20 to drive a sealed freight wagon from a crossing point on the border to Crane's silver mine north of town. He did not ask questions because the money was good and he was broke and drunk and did not want to know. He had driven the wagon, collected his pay, and gone back to his bottle. Now, kneeling in the dust beside this broken woman, staring at the same brand he had seen on a dead child he chose not to see, the weight of what he had looked away from settled on his shoulders like a stone. He checked her breathing, shallow but steady. She was alive, barely. He lifted her as carefully as he could, one arm under her knees and one behind her back. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her up the slope and laid her across the saddle, then walked the horse back to the cabin, keeping one hand on her shoulder to stop her from sliding. Inside, he placed her on the bed and began cleaning her wounds. Warm water, clean cloth, careful hands. He was wrapping a bandage around the gash on her arm when she woke up. The change was instant. One moment she was still, the next she was a storm. Her eyes snapped open, wild and dark, and her body exploded into motion. She bit his hand hard enough to draw blood. She clawed at his face, leaving red lines across his cheek. She rolled off the bed and hit the floor and scrambled backward until her shoulders struck the wall. Her hand came up holding a sharpened bone pin, no longer than a finger, aimed at his chest. Her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of someone who had already killed to survive and would do it again without hesitation. Daniel froze. Blood dripped from the bite on his hand. He could feel the sting of the scratches on his face. The woman crouched in the corner, trembling, the bone pin steady as a blade. Her breathing was ragged. Her lips were cracked, but her aim was true and her grip was iron. He had seen fear before, in men on the battlefield, in animals caught in traps. But this was different. She was not afraid of dying. She was afraid of him. Afraid of what his hat and his boots and the revolver on his hip meant in her world. In her world, men who looked like Daniel did not rescue Apache women. They chained them, worked them, branded them with a hot iron and buried them beside the trail when they stopped being useful. Daniel raised both hands, palms out. He took one step back, then another. He bent slowly and placed the water bowl and the clean cloth on the floor between them. Then he backed out through the door and closed it gently. He sat on the porch all night. The desert cold crept in around midnight, and he pulled his coat tighter and watched the stars wheel overhead and listened to the silence inside the cabin. He did not try to go back in. He did not knock. He just sat there, bleeding from the hand, thinking about a dead boy beside a trail in a sealed wagon he never opened and a brand burned into living skin. By morning, the water bowl was empty, the cloth was stained with blood, and the bone pin was buried in the door frame at heart height, the clearest warning she could send without a single word. Kaya had counted 3 ways out of this cabin. She only needed her legs to hold her long enough to use one. She crouched against the back wall in the gray light of early morning, listening to the sounds outside. Birds, wind, the creak of a chair on wooden planks. He was still out there. The cowboy. She had not slept. Every time her eyes started to close, the darkness behind her lids filled with images she could not stop. The night the raiders came. The sound of gunfire and screaming, her father's rifle cracking once, twice, 3 times, and then silence. The hands that grabbed her arms and threw her into the back of a wagon with 7 other women. The darkness of the mine shaft. The heat of the branding iron. She pressed her back harder against the wall and flexed her fingers. Her hands ached. Her whole body ached. The wound in her side had stopped bleeding, but it throbbed with every heartbeat. A deep pulse of pain that told her things were wrong inside where she could not reach. She knew herbs that could help. She had been trained by her mother, the finest healer their band had ever known. A woman who could set a broken bone by moonlight and brew a tea that pulled fever from a child's body, like drawing venom from a snake bite. Her mother had died when Kaya was 15, killed not by violence but by the coughing sickness that took so many. And Kaya had carried her knowledge forward like a flame cupped in both hands. But knowledge meant nothing without the plants. And the plants were outside. And outside was where the cowboy sat. She watched him through the crack in the door. He was sitting on the porch with his back against the post, his hat pulled low, his injured hand wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his own shirt. He was not sleeping. She could see his eyes half open, fixed on the middle distance. He looked tired. Not the tiredness of one bad night, but the tiredness of years. She studied him the way her father had taught her to study enemies. His build, his weapons, his habits. He wore a revolver on his right hip, well-oiled, well-used. His boots were scuffed but solid. His clothes were plain, no silver, no show. He moved like a man who had been trained to move quietly, with an economy of motion that suggested either military service or law work. His hands were strong but not cruel. He had held her carefully when he carried her. She remembered that, even through the haze of pain. His grip had been firm, but his fingers had not dug into her skin the way the guards at the mine had gripped her. None of this meant anything. Kindness was the most dangerous weapon a man could carry because it made you lower your guard before the blow came. She watched him stand and walk to the fire pit. He built a fire and set a pot over it. The smell of cooking beans drifted through the cabin walls. Her stomach cramped. She had not eaten properly in weeks. In the mine, they were given a handful of corn mush twice a day. Enough to keep you standing. Not enough to keep you strong. He carried the pot to the door and set it down on the ground outside. Then he walked away. Not to the barn, not to the corral. He walked 50 paces across the clearing and sat down on a stump with his back to the cabin. He was giving her space. She waited. 10 minutes. 20. The smell of the beans was unbearable. Finally, she cracked the door and looked out. He had not moved. She reached down and pulled the pot inside, then closed the door. She examined the food carefully, smelling it, touching a small amount to her tongue and waiting. No bitterness, no chemical taste, no telltale scent of the root they used in the mine to keep the captives docile. Clean food. She ate slowly, forcing herself to stop before her shrunken stomach rebelled. Then she sat with the empty pot in her lap and tried to understand what was happening. In her experience, white men fell into two categories. The first kind hurt you immediately, openly, without pretense. You knew where you stood with them because the bruises told you. The second kind were patient. They fed you. They let you rest. They waited until your defenses dropped, and then they took what they wanted. And by then, you were too grateful and too confused to fight back. She placed the cowboy in the second category and resolved to be ready when the mask came off. That afternoon, she tested him. She pushed open the door and stepped outside into the sunlight. The brightness stung her eyes after weeks in the mine. The air tasted different here, clean, dry, alive. She could smell creosote and sage and the mineral tang of canyon rock warming in the sun. She stood on the porch and let the wind touch her face. The cowboy was at the horse corral, mending a fence rail. He looked up when she appeared but did not move toward her. Beside the corral, a saddled horse stood near the gate. Not tied, just standing there, reins loose, as if waiting for someone to ride. Her heart beat faster. She could reach that horse in 30 steps. She could mount and ride and be in the canyon before he reached his own animal. She moved toward it, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. 20 steps. 15. 10. The horse turned its head and watched her approach with calm brown eyes. Then her body failed her. The wound in her side tore open, and the pain hit like a fist, and her knees buckled and she went down hard in the dirt. She felt the warm spread of blood soaking through the bandage. Footsteps. Fast. She braced herself, waiting for hands to grab her, to drag her back inside. But the footsteps stopped. She looked up through the tangle of her hair and saw the cowboy 3 paces away. He had run to her, but he had stopped. He was not reaching for her. He was not touching her. He simply lowered himself to the ground and sat in the dirt at that distance, cross-legged, hands in his lap, and waited. She stared at him. The afternoon sun was behind him and his face was partly in shadow, but she could see his eyes clearly, and what she saw there confused her more than anything else he had done. His eyes held pain. Not the sharp pain of the moment, but something old and deep, like a wound that had healed on the outside but never stopped bleeding underneath. She recognized it because she carried the same thing. This man was running from something too. She did not know why that mattered. It should not have mattered. He was still a white man with a gun and a cabin in the territory where her people were hunted like deer. But something in the way he sat there in the dirt, making no demands, asking nothing, just waiting for her to decide what happened next, cracked something open inside her chest. She let him help her stand. Not because she trusted him, but because for the first time she was looking at someone more broken than herself. Tom Ludlow only rode out to Daniel's cabin when trouble was coming. Today he arrived with a pistol tucked in his belt instead of his usual walking stick. Daniel heard the horse before he saw it. The sound of hooves on the canyon trail carried a long way in the still morning air, and he was standing on the porch with his coffee when Tom appeared around the bend, riding hard for a man with one leg. His face was red and his hat was pushed back, and his horse was lathered at the neck. Daniel set his cup down. Inside the cabin, the door was closed. Kaya was sleeping. He had spent the last 2 days establishing a routine. Food left at the door, water in a basin, clean cloth for bandages. He never entered without knocking first. He never stayed longer than it took to set things down and back away. It was slow work, this business of convincing someone you meant no harm, and he knew it might not work at all. Tom pulled up at the hitching rail and swung down awkwardly, his wooden leg thudding against the stirrup. He was breathing hard. Daniel had known Tom Ludlow for nearly 3 years. The man ran the general store in Copper Bluff, kept a clean shop, spoke quietly, and knew everything that happened within 50 miles of town. He was a Gettysburg veteran who had left his left leg and most of his illusions on a field in Pennsylvania and come west to find peace. He had found it mostly until now. "You need to hear this," Tom said without preamble. He limped to the porch and leaned against the rail, catching his breath. "Virgil Crane posted a bounty this morning, $200 for the return of an Apache woman who escaped his mine and killed a guard on her way out. He is telling the whole town she is a murderer, a dangerous fugitive. Boggs has already deputized 2 men and sent riders to the border towns." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet. $200 was an enormous sum. It was more than most men in the territory earned in 6 months. Every bounty hunter, every drifter, every desperate rancher with a rifle and a horse would be looking for her. Tom's eyes moved to the cabin door. "Daniel, I know you have someone in there." Daniel said nothing. "I can see the second plate by the fire pit. I can see the bandage cloth drying on the line. And I can see the look on your face, which is the look of a man who knows he is in deeper than he planned." Tom paused. "Is it her? The one Crane is looking for?" Daniel met his friend's eyes and held them. "She has the brand, Tom. The sea burned into her arm like she was livestock." Tom closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were heavy. "I know what that brand means. You know I know. Because I am the one who told you about the wagon." The words landed like stones in still water. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. 2 years ago, sitting in the back room of Tom's store, 3 drinks past good judgment, he had mentioned the sealed freight wagon he hauled for Crane when he first arrived in the territory. He had mentioned it casually, the way a man mentions a job he took and forgot about. Tom had gone very still. Then Tom had told him what that wagon carried. People, Tom had said. Native people. Women and children, mostly. Crane runs them from the border crossings to his mine, uses them for labor, keeps them underground where nobody sees them. I found out because one of his teamsters got drunk in my store and talked too much. I did not report it because Crane owns the sheriff and half the town council, and reporting it would have gotten me buried in the desert. Daniel had listened to Tom's words that night and felt the floor tilt beneath him. He had hauled a wagon full of human beings to a place where they would be worked until they broke. And he had not opened the cargo because the $20 felt good in his pocket and the whiskey felt better in his throat. And then, months later, he had found the dead boy beside the trail with the same brand, and he had ridden on. Now Tom stood on his porch and said the thing neither of them wanted to hear. "You drove that wagon, Daniel. You did not know what was inside. I believe that. But you found that dead boy afterward, and you did nothing. I found out the truth, and I did nothing. We are both part of this, whether we like it or not." The silence between them stretched tight as wire. "What do you want me to do?" Daniel asked. His voice was flat and careful. "I want you to understand what you're sitting on. If Crane finds out she's here, it is not just her who dies. It is you. And it is me, because I know and I came here, and that makes me an accomplice." Tom's face was drawn. "You have maybe 2 weeks before the bounty hunters sweep this far out. 3 at the most. After that, you are going to have visitors with guns and bad intentions, and there will not be a damn thing I can do to stop them." Tom climbed back on his horse and looked down at Daniel with an expression that was part fear, part sorrow, and part something that might have been respect. "Whatever you decide, decide fast." Then he turned the horse and rode back down the canyon trail, and Daniel watched him go until the dust settled and the silence returned. He stood on the porch for a long time. The sun climbed higher, and the shadows pulled back from the canyon walls. Inside the cabin, he heard movement, the creak of the bed frame, careful footsteps on the wooden floor. He knocked on the door frame. "It is Daniel. I am coming in." He waited 3 full breaths, then pushed the door open. She was standing beside the window. She had heard the conversation, or at least part of it. He could see it in her face. The guarded look was still there, the wariness that never fully left her eyes, but underneath it was something new. Alertness. Focus. The look of a woman assessing a situation, not just surviving one. She spoke before he could. Her voice was rough and low, her English halting but clear. She had learned it, she would later tell him, from a missionary preacher who had visited her band when she was a child. The preacher had stayed 2 summers and taught her words in exchange for her mother's herbal remedies. She had hated him for coming uninvited into her world, but she had kept the words because words were tools, and tools kept you alive. "I know what he said," she told Daniel. "The man with 1 leg. I heard the name. Crane." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was harder. "The silver hair man. He keeps more people. Not only me." Daniel felt the weight of the question before he asked it. "How many?" She held up both hands, fingers spread. Then she held them up again. 20. Maybe more." "Where?" "The mine. Under the ground. Women. Children." Her eyes did not waver. "I was there 6 weeks. I escaped. The others did not." Daniel stared at her. Behind his eyes, the dead boy's face floated up from the place where he had buried it. The boy with the brand, the boy beside the trail. He saw the sealed wagon, the padlocked gate, the $20 in his hand. He saw the bottle he had crawled into afterward and the years he had spent pretending that not knowing was the same as not being responsible. It was not the same. It had never been the same. "I heard more," she said. "The man said you carried a wagon for Crane before." The words hit him like a closed fist. She had heard that part too. He watched her face change as she processed it. The wariness sharpened into something colder, something that might have been disgust. "I did not know what was inside," Daniel said. The words sounded thin and useless, even as they left his mouth. "But you found out later," she said. It was not a question. "Yes. And you did nothing." The silence that followed was the worst silence Daniel had ever sat in. Worse than the courtroom. Worse than the night on the dirt road with the toy gun in his hand. Because this silence came from a woman who bore the consequences of his cowardice in her own burned flesh, and she was standing 3 feet away looking at him with eyes that demanded the truth. "I did nothing," he said. "And I have no words that make that right." She held his gaze for a long time. He could see her calculating, weighing, deciding whether this confession made him more dangerous or less. Whether honesty was just another kind of trap. Finally, she told him her name. "Kaya," she said. "It means elder sister. My mother chose it because she wanted me to protect people." A flicker of something dark crossed her face. "I have not done a very good job." Daniel recognized the guilt in her voice because it was a mirror of his own. She was not angry at him. She was angry at herself. She had run from the mine alone, saved herself, and left the others behind, and that choice was eating her from the inside out the same way the sealed wagon was eating him. "The children do not cry anymore," Kaya said quietly. "When children stop crying, it means they have stopped hoping." Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. Not courage, not yet, but the death of the last excuse he had for doing nothing. She healed the wound on his hand with a plant he thought was a weed. He taught her to shoot with the revolver she had once imagined using to kill him. 3 days had passed since Tom's visit, and the shape of life in the cabin had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small ways that added up to something neither Daniel nor Kaya had a name for. She no longer flinched when he knocked on the doorframe. He no longer hesitated before entering. She ate at the table now instead of on the floor in the corner. He had moved his bedroll to the porch permanently, not because she asked, but because he understood that the space she needed was not just physical, but symbolic. The cabin was hers. The open air was his. The boundary was unspoken and absolute. On the morning of the fourth day, Kaya stepped outside and studied the land around the cabin with the focused attention of someone cataloging resources. Daniel watched from the corral where he was mending a broken fence rail. She walked slowly through the brush near the creek, bending occasionally to examine a plant, touching leaves, smelling roots. She moved with a confidence he had not seen in her before. This was not the cautious movement of a wounded woman testing her limits. This was a professional working in her field. She returned 20 minutes later with a handful of green stems and a clump of root that smelled sharp and earthy. She sat down on the porch step and began stripping the leaves, her fingers quick and certain. Daniel drifted closer, curious despite himself. "What is that?" he asked, nodding toward the plant. "Yerba mansa," she said without looking up. "It grows where the water sits under the ground. The root draws out infection. The leaves stop swelling." She glanced at his injured hand, still wrapped in the strip of shirt he had torn 3 days ago. "Give me your hand." He hesitated. "I bit you," she said flatly. "I should fix it." There was no apology in her voice. It was a statement of practical fact. She had caused the wound. She would treat the wound. The transaction was simple and clean, and something about its simplicity made Daniel trust it more than any kind words could have. He sat down beside her on the step, close enough to reach, and extended his hand. She unwrapped the makeshift bandage carefully. The bite was deep and the skin around it was red and warm to the touch, the early signs of infection. She made a face that said she was not surprised. She ground the root between 2 stones and mixed it with water from the canteen to make a thick paste. She packed the paste into the wound, covered it with the stripped leaves, and bound it with a fresh cloth torn from the hem of a spare shirt. Her hands were steady and sure. She worked the way a carpenter works with wood, or a blacksmith works with iron, with the unself-conscious ease of someone doing something they were born to do. "Your mother taught you this," Daniel said. It was not a question. Kaya's hands paused for just a moment. "My mother could heal almost anything. She knew every plant between the mountains and the river. She knew which bark to boil for fever, and which clay to pack into a wound to stop the bleeding. People came to her from other bands from 3 and 4 days' ride away." She finished tying the bandage and let go of his hand. "She died when I was 15. The coughing sickness. She could heal everyone except herself." The grief in her voice was old and deep, woven into the fabric of who she was. Daniel recognized it. His own grief was a different shape, a different weight, but it lived in the same place, somewhere behind the sternum where no bandage could reach. "She would be proud of you," he said. Kaya looked at him sharply. "Do not say things you do not know." He accepted the rebuke. She was right. He did not know, but he believed it. That afternoon, the balance shifted in the other direction. Daniel set up a line of tin cans on the corral fence and took out his revolver. He checked the cylinder, loaded 5 chambers, and left 1 empty the way he always did, and fired 3 rounds in quick succession. 3 cans jumped off the fence and landed in the dust. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and faded into the afternoon heat. When he turned around, Kaya was watching him from the porch. Her expression was unreadable. "You should learn to use one of these," he said. He held the revolver by the barrel, grip extended toward her. She stared at the gun. "Why?" "Because there are men coming who will not be as patient as I am." And because you deserve to be able to defend yourself without having to get close enough to use a bone pin." She came down the steps slowly. She took the revolver from his hand. It was heavy, and she held it awkwardly, but her grip was strong and her arm was steady. He moved behind her, keeping a careful distance, and talked her through the stance. Feet apart. Weight forward. Both hands on the grip. Sight down the barrel. Squeeze the trigger. Do not pull it. She fired. The shot went wide and the recoil knocked her back a half step. She set her jaw and fired again. Closer. The third shot hit the can dead center and sent it spinning into the brush. She turned to look at him, and there it was. A smile. The first one he had seen from her. It was small and fleeting, gone almost before it arrived, but it changed her whole face. For one heartbeat, she was not a survivor, not a fugitive, not a woman with a brand on her arm. She was just a person who had done something well and was pleased about it. Daniel's heart did something complicated in his chest. He said nothing about it. They were reloading for another round when the vultures appeared. 3 of them, circling in slow black spirals a half-mile to the east, dropping lower with each pass. Daniel watched them for a moment, then looked at Kaya. She was already watching. They both knew what vultures circling low in the afternoon meant. Something was dead, and it was not small. They walked together to the site. Daniel carried his revolver. Kaya carried the bone pin she still kept tucked into the waist of her mended skirt. They found the horse at the bottom of a dry wash, still saddled, its body bloated in the heat. A rattlesnake bite on the left foreleg, judging by the swelling. The animal had gone down hard and fast. The saddlebags bore a mark Daniel recognized, an outfit out of Tucson that specialized in finding people who did not want to be found. Bounty hunter. The rider was gone. The tracks led south toward Copper Bluff. Boot prints, deep and uneven. A man walking hard in the heat, probably sunburned, probably angry, and headed straight for a town where information about an Apache fugitive was worth $200. Daniel stood over the dead horse and felt the clock in his chest start ticking. When that man reached Copper Bluff, he would tell anyone who would listen about the cabin at the end of the canyon trail, about the horse corral and the mended fence and the fire pit with 2 plates beside it. Days. They had days now, not weeks. They walked back to the cabin in silence. The mood had changed. The easy rhythm of the afternoon was gone, replaced by something tight and urgent that pressed against their skin like a coming storm. That evening they sat by the fire. The sky darkened and the stars came out in thick clusters overhead, and the desert cold crept in from the edges of the world. Daniel fed the fire and watched the sparks rise and disappear. Kaya sat across from him, her knees drawn up, her face lit in flickering orange. "I need to tell you something," Daniel said. "Something I have never told anyone." She watched him, waiting. He told her about the boy, the Mexican teenager on the dirt road outside Las Cruces, the shape in the dark, the thing in the boy's hand that looked like a gun and was not a gun, the single shot, the toy gun in the dust, the mother screaming in the courtroom, the badge on the captain's desk, the bottle, the years. He told it straight and plain, without drama, without asking for pity. He told it the way a man empties his pockets before a long walk, setting down each item so he can see clearly what he has been carrying. When he finished, the fire crackled, and the coyotes called from the ridge, and the silence held them both. Kaya spoke carefully. "Among my people, when a warrior carries the spirit of someone he has killed, he cannot rest until he goes to the family and asks permission to continue living. It is called the burden walk. You travel to the place where the family lives, and you sit outside their home, and you wait. If they come out and speak to you, you may begin again. If they do not, you carry it forever." "What if they will not forgive?" Daniel asked. "Then you carry it. But carrying with your eyes open is not the same as being crushed with your eyes closed. One is a wound, the other is a grave. Daniel stared at the fire for a long time. No one had ever said anything like that to him. Not the judge who cleared him, not the captain who accepted his badge, not the bottle he crawled into. Every other response to his guilt had been either absolution he did not deserve or condemnation he could not survive. This was neither. This was simply the truth, spoken by a woman who understood wounds because her life had been made of them. He looked at her across the fire, and something shifted between them. It was not romance, not yet. It was the recognition of two people standing in the same dark place and realizing they were not alone there. Later, after the fire burned low, Daniel walked to the stable to check the horses. He reached behind the feed bin for the bottle he had hidden there the week before Kaya arrived. A fresh bottle, unopened. His emergency supply, the one he kept for the nights when the dead boy's face got too close. The bottle was not there. He looked around, confused, then walked outside. He found it in the dirt behind the stable, empty. The cap was off, and the ground beneath it was wet and reeking of whiskey. She had found it. She had poured it out. Anger flared in his chest, hot and immediate. He strode back to the cabin and stood in the doorway. "You poured out my whiskey." Kaya looked up from the bed where she was lying with her hands behind her head. "Yes, that was mine. You had no right. It was poison. I am a healer. I do not leave poison where it can reach people I care about." The last three words stopped him cold. People I care about. She said it without emphasis, without drama. The way she might say, "The sky is blue," or "The creek runs south." A simple fact. Daniel stood in the doorway with his anger draining out of him like water from a cracked jug. She was right, and he knew she was right, and the knowing made him ashamed, not of the anger, but of the bottle, of needing it, of hiding it like a secret. "That was the last one," he said finally. "Good," she said, and closed her eyes. That night, for the first time since he surrendered his badge, Daniel slept without dreaming of gunfire. Instead, he dreamed of herbs and creek water and the sound of someone laughing. But outside in the dark, a man with no horse was walking toward Copper Bluff, and he had a story to sell. Daniel knew that bringing medicine back from town was a risk, but the infection in Kaya's side was spreading faster than her herbs could fight, and time was a luxury a dead horse had already stolen from them. He woke before dawn and found Kaya burning with fever. Her skin was hot to the touch, and her eyes were glassy, and she was murmuring in Apache, words he could not understand but whose tone was unmistakable. Fear, pain, the deep delirium of a body losing its fight against infection. The wound in her side, the one that had reopened when she fell in the yard, had turned angry and dark at the edges. Red streaks ran outward from the gash like fingers reaching for her heart. Her own remedies had slowed the infection but could not kill it. She needed quinine. She needed carbolic acid. She needed medicines that came in glass bottles from the east and cost money and could only be bought in Copper Bluff, 12 miles south, in a town where a $200 bounty had every eye watching and every tongue wagging. Daniel saddled his horse and rode to Tom's place first. He found the old man sweeping his porch in the early light and told him the situation in short, flat sentences. Tom listened without interrupting, then set his broom against the wall and said, "I will go sit with her. You be careful in town. Crane has eyes everywhere." Daniel rode into Copper Bluff just after 9 in the morning. The town sat in a shallow valley between two ridges of red rock, a single main street lined with wooden buildings that leaned slightly in the wind, a church at one end, a saloon at the other. Between them, Tom's general store, a livery stable, a rooming house, a barber who doubled as a dentist, and the offices of the Copper Bluff Mining Company, which everyone knew belonged to Virgil Crane, even though his name did not appear on the sign. The town was busy, riders coming and going, wagons loading at the feed store. A pair of men Daniel did not recognize leaned against the saloon wall, watching the street with the patient attention of people who were being paid to watch. Bounty hunters. He could spot them from 100 yards. They had a look, lean, watchful, empty-eyed. Men who had done the math on human life and decided $200 was enough. He tied his horse at Tom's store and went inside. The store smelled of coffee and leather and dried beans. Behind the counter, a young woman was sorting bottles on a shelf. She turned when the bell above the door rang, and Daniel found himself looking at Nora Crane. He had seen her before, in passing. She was small and fine-boned, with her father's silver-blonde hair, but none of his sharpness. Her eyes were the color of creek water, and they carried a heaviness that did not match her age. She was 25 years old, and she was the only schoolteacher in Copper Bluff, and she was Virgil Crane's daughter, which meant she lived in the largest house in town and wore the nicest dresses and attended church every Sunday in the front pew, and never ever spoke out of turn. "Morning," Daniel said. "I need quinine, carbolic acid, and about 10 yards of clean bandaging." Nora's hands stopped moving on the shelf. She turned fully to face him and studied him for a long moment. Her eyes lingered on the fresh scratches on his face, on the bandaged hand, on the quantity of medical supplies he was requesting. "That is a lot of doctoring," she said quietly. "For who?" "Sick horse," Daniel said. Nora's expression did not change. She held his gaze for 3 beats too long. Then she turned and began collecting the items from the shelves behind the counter. She wrapped them in brown paper and tied the package with string and placed it on the counter. She told him the price. He paid. As he picked up the package, he felt something extra inside. Something small and heavy that had not been there when she placed the items on the counter. He looked at Nora. She was already turned away, sorting bottles again, her back to him. She did not acknowledge the look. He left the store and tucked the package into his saddlebag. Later, when he opened it at the cabin, he would find a glass vial of concentrated antiseptic tucked inside the bandaging. More expensive than the quinine. Not on the receipt. A gift from Virgil Crane's daughter to a man she barely knew, slipped in without a word. He was untying his horse when a voice stopped him. "Daniel Hayes. Well now, it has been a while." He turned, and there was Virgil Crane walking up the boardwalk with the easy stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. Crane was tall and lean, silver-haired, clean-shaven, dressed in a dark vest over a white shirt with a gold watch chain glinting in the morning sun. His boots were polished. His hat was spotless. He looked like a man who had never been dirty in his life, which was ironic given that his fortune came from a hole in the ground. "Mr. Crane," Daniel said, "I was just thinking about you the other day." Crane stopped a comfortable distance away and smiled a smile that did not involve his eyes. "Heard you are still living out there in that canyon. Lonesome country. A man alone out there for too long starts to see things, hear things, maybe even starts imagining company where there is none." Daniel kept his face still. "I like the quiet." "Oh, I can understand that. I can." Crane tilted his head slightly the way a dog does when it hears a sound it cannot identify. "Still, it is a strange time to be a hermit. Lot of rough characters passing through lately. Bounty men, drifters. Looking for some Apache woman who murdered one of my mine workers. Dangerous woman, by all accounts." He paused. "You have not seen anything unusual out your way, have you?" "Nothing but coyotes and rattlesnakes." "Good, good." Crane's smile widened. "You take care of yourself out there, Daniel. The desert is no place to be caught off guard." He tipped his hat and walked on, his boots clicking on the boardwalk with the measured rhythm of a man who had all the time in the world. Daniel mounted his horse and rode out of town at a pace that was deliberately unhurried. He did not look back. He did not need to. He could feel the eyes on him. Crane's eyes, the bounty hunter's eyes, the town's eyes. Copper Bluff had 2 faces, and the one it showed to strangers was a mask stretched over something rotten. On his way out, he passed the notice board outside the saloon. Among the bills and advertisements and yellowed government notices, one caught his eye. His own face stared back at him from a poster he had forgotten existed. "Wanted," it read across the top in thick black letters. Information on whereabouts of Deputy United States Marshal Daniel Hayes. Failed to report. Contact Territorial Marshal's Office, Tucson. The poster was 3 years old and faded, the paper curling at the edges. It meant nothing to anyone who could read. But to someone who could not read English well, someone who might only recognize the word "wanted" and the face beneath it told a very different story. He pulled the poster off the board and folded it into his pocket without thinking. He would forget about it later. He would not realize until it was nearly too late that someone had already seen it. A mile from the cabin, he pulled his horse up short, fresh hoof prints in the sandy wash near the canyon mouth. 2 riders. They had come close, within a quarter-mile of the trail that led to his cabin, then turned back. The prints were sharp-edged, recent. Maybe that same morning. He rode the rest of the way with his hand on his revolver. Tom was sitting on the porch with the shotgun across his knees when Daniel came up the trail. The old man's face was grave. "Visitors," Tom said quietly. 2 men. Rode up mid-morning asking about the old mine road north. I told them it was washed out. They nodded polite and turned around, but their eyes were wrong, Daniel. Their eyes kept moving to the cabin windows. Daniel dismounted and looked toward the cabin. The door was closed. "She heard them," Tom said. "She was sitting up by the time they came around the bend. Had that bone pin in her hand. I told her to stay quiet and stay down, and she did, but I could see her through the window. And I tell you the truth, if those men had tried to come inside, I do not think either of us could have stopped her from putting that pin through somebody's neck." Daniel nodded slowly. He thanked Tom and watched him ride out. Then he went inside. Kaya was sitting on the edge of the bed, pale but alert, the bone pin resting across her knees. Her fever had broken sometime in the morning. She was soaked in sweat and her hands were trembling, but her eyes were clear and hard and focused. "I heard horses," she said. "I know. They were looking for me. They were looking. They did not find. They will come back." "Yes," Daniel said, "they will." He set the medicine on the table and began preparing the quinine. Kaya watched him work, and after a moment she reached out and took the bandaging from his hands and began mixing the carbolic acid herself, measuring by smell and color with the confidence of someone who had compounded medicines since childhood. They worked side by side in the small cabin, 2 people preparing for a fight that both of them knew was coming. And neither of them spoke about the thing that hung in the air between them, which was the fact that in order to survive what was coming, they were going to have to trust each other completely, and neither of them had trusted anyone completely in a very long time. Kaya had healed warriors, delivered babies, and closed the eyes of the dead. But she had no remedy for what was happening inside her chest every time Daniel looked at her, and then looked away, as though the looking itself was something he needed permission for. She was recovering. The quinine and the carbolic acid, combined with her own herbal treatments, had turned the infection back. The red streaks on her side were fading. Her strength was returning in increments. Each morning she could do a little more, walk a little farther, carry a little more weight. Her body was remembering what it meant to be whole, and with the return of her strength came the return of something else. The guilt she had been too sick to carry. 22 people were still in that mine. Women who had shared the darkness with her. Children who had stopped crying. An old woman named Grey Dove, who had braided Kaya's hair on the first night of captivity, and whispered stories to keep the young ones from screaming. They were still there, still underground, still bearing Crane's brand. And Kaya was here, sleeping in a bed, eating warm food, watching a man who made her feel things she had no right to feel while her people suffered in the dark. The guilt gnawed at her like a rat in the walls. She could hear it at night, chewing through her sleep, waking her at the darkest hour to ask the question she could not answer. You ran. You saved yourself. How can you rest while they suffer? She kept these thoughts hidden from Daniel. She was good at hiding. Years of living in a world that punished vulnerability had taught her to keep her pain in a locked room where no one else could see it. But the room was filling up, and the lock was starting to strain. On the fifth night after the bounty hunters passed by, Kaya lay awake listening to Daniel breathe on the porch. The rhythm was steady and deep. He was asleep. She rose silently, dressed in the dark, and slipped out through the back window. She took the spare horse from the corral, saddling it with practiced hands. She had been watching Daniel handle the tack for days, learning the buckles and straps. She led the horse on foot until she was a quarter-mile from the cabin, then mounted and rode north. She knew the way. Her people had migrated through this country for generations, following water and game along trails that no white map had ever charted. She knew the eastern canyon route that led to the backside of Crane's mining operation, a narrow passage through a split in the rock that was invisible unless you knew where to look. Her grandmother had shown it to her when she was 12 on a journey between summer and winter camps. Now she used it to scout the perimeter of the prison where she had been held. She reached the mine before dawn. From a high ledge overlooking the entrance, she counted the guards. 2 at this hour, both tired, both sitting around a fire near the main shaft, rifles propped against a rock. She mapped the terrain in her mind. Entry points, exit routes, the distance from the holding chamber to the eastern passage, the number of people who would need to move and the time it would take to move them. She watched for an hour, memorizing the rhythm of the guards' movements, then turned the horse and rode hard for the cabin. She arrived before sunrise, unsaddled the horse, and slipped back through the window. Her heart was pounding. She lay down on the bed and pulled the blanket up and steadied her breathing. She thought Daniel did not know. She was wrong. Daniel was a former lawman. He read tracks the way most people read faces. When he walked to the corral that morning, he saw that the spare horse had been ridden hard. Its coat was still damp with sweat beneath the saddle line. The hoof prints near the gate were fresh, pressed deep into the soft ground, indicating a fast departure and a hard return. The prints led north. He said nothing. But that morning, for the first time in 3 years, he took his revolver apart and cleaned it. Every pin, every spring, every chamber. He oiled the action and reloaded it and set it on the table where Kaya could see it. Then he sat down and began sharpening his knife on a whetstone, slow and methodical, the sound filling the cabin like a heartbeat. Kaya watched him from the bed. She understood what the gun on the table meant. He was preparing. But she also understood what his silence about her night ride meant. He knew she had gone. He was not going to stop her. He was going to let her make her own choices, even the ones he disagreed with, because that was who he was. It was this realization, more than any kindness, more than any word, that finally broke something loose inside her. And then the poster ruined everything. She found it that afternoon. Daniel had gone to the creek to fill the water jugs, and Kaya, driven by the old survival habit of checking her surroundings for threats, went through his saddlebag. She was not looking for secrets. She was looking for weapons, ammunition, anything that might help or hinder. What she found was a folded piece of paper. She opened it and her blood went cold. Daniel's face, printed on a government notice. And above his face, in large black letters, the only English word she recognized with absolute certainty: wanted. She could not read the smaller text beneath. She did not know it said information on whereabouts or failed to report. She saw only the word that mattered: wanted. The word they put on papers when a man was hunted, when a man was a criminal, an outlaw, a killer. She had given her trust to a fugitive. The betrayal hit her like a fist to the chest. Not anger, grief, the raw, scraping grief of a woman who had dared to believe she was safe and now faced the possibility that safety had been a lie, again. She folded the poster and put it back. She did not confront him. Instead, she did what she always did when threatened. She retreated. She pulled her walls up like a drawbridge and sealed herself inside. Daniel noticed the change immediately. One day she was sitting beside him at the fire, her shoulder almost touching his. The next day she sat across from him with the bone pin in reach. She stopped smiling. She stopped asking questions. She answered his questions in one or two words and then looked away. The warmth that had been building between them, slow and fragile as a candle flame in the wind, was gone. "What changed?" he asked on the second evening. "Nothing," she said. "Something changed." "Tell me." "Nothing." He let it go. But he watched her the way she watched him, and he could see the fortress going back up stone by stone. On the third evening, the tension became unbearable. Kaya had spent the day pacing the cabin like a caged animal, and Daniel had spent the day trying and failing to figure out what he had done wrong. Finally, as the sun went down and the fire crackled between them, he asked the question directly. "Kaya, what did I do?" Something in his voice, the genuine confusion, the absence of anger, cracked her resolve. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded poster and threw it at his feet. "This is what you are," she said. Her voice was shaking, not with rage, with sorrow. "Wanted. A hunted man, and I trusted you." Daniel picked up the poster and unfolded it. He stared at it for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was a short, harsh sound, bitter as bad coffee. "Kaya, this is not a criminal warrant. It says, wanted. Your face. Wanted. It says wanted for information, not wanted for a crime." He held the poster toward her and pointed at the smaller text. "I cannot expect you to read this, so I will tell you what it says. It says the government is looking for a deputy marshal who walked away from his post, who quit without permission, who disappeared." He set the poster down. "I am not a criminal, Kaya. I am a coward. There is a difference." She stared at him. The fortress trembled. "I ran from my job because I killed a boy and could not live with myself. I came here to hide. I hauled a wagon I should not have hauled. I found a dead child I should not have ignored. And I drank myself half-blind for 2 years because facing the truth was harder than drowning it." He met her eyes. "You are not wrong to be careful with me. I have given you every reason to doubt me. I am still figuring out whether I am someone worth trusting." The silence stretched. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling into the dark sky. "You are," Kaya said at last. Her voice was quiet. "Not because you say it. Because you stayed when I hurt you, and you left when I needed space, and you never once made me pay for either." The words settled between them like stones placed carefully in a stream, changing the direction of the current. Daniel felt something unlock in his chest. Not forgiveness. Something before forgiveness. The possibility that he might be worth forgiving. And then, because Kaya was Kaya and could not rest while others suffered, she told him what she had seen at the mine. The 2 guards, the eastern passage, the holding chamber layout, the number of people, the route out. "We have to go back for them," she said. "You know that. 2 people cannot take on an armed camp." "Then we find a way that 2 people can. Or we find more people." "Who?" "Tom has 1 leg. The sheriff works for Crane. The town is afraid of its own shadow." Kaya stood up and walked to the edge of the firelight. She looked north toward the dark line of the ridge that hid the mine from view. "I will go," she said without turning, "with you or without you." Daniel looked at her standing there in the firelight with the desert wind pulling at her hair and the bone pin glinting at her waist, and he knew 2 things with absolute certainty. The first was that she meant it. The second was that if she went alone, she would die. He stood up and walked to where she stood and sat down on the rock beside her. Not to argue, not to persuade, just to let her know that without him was no longer an option. Daniel's old badge had been sitting at the bottom of his saddlebag for 3 years. He took it out that morning, not to wear, but to remember who he had been before he became the kind of man who looked the other way. The star was tarnished. The pin on the back was bent slightly where he had torn it from his vest the day he walked out of the marshal's office in Las Cruces. He held it in his palm and felt the weight of it, heavier than metal, heavy with all the things it represented. Law, duty, The belief that one man with a badge could make a difference. He had believed that once, before the dirt road, before the toy gun, before the sound of a boy hitting the ground. He put the badge in his vest pocket, not pinned but close, and rode to Copper Bluff. Tom was closing the store when Daniel came in through the back door. The old man took one look at his face and said, "Lord help us, you have that look." "I need information," Daniel said, "about Crane's mine, guard rotation, entry points. How many men he keeps armed and where he keeps them." Tom sat down heavily and rubbed his face with both hands. "You are going to get yourself killed." "Maybe. Help me anyway." They spent an hour in the back room of the store with a piece of butcher paper spread on the table, sketching what they knew. Tom's information came from years of listening to miners and teamsters who drank at the saloon and talked when they should not have. He knew the general layout of the mine. He knew that Crane kept the captives in a chamber below the main shaft, accessible by a single tunnel. He knew the guard schedule was thin at night because Crane was cheap, and because he believed no one would dare challenge him. But the details were incomplete. The map had gaps. The plan had holes. Then someone knocked on the back door. Tom froze. Daniel's hand went to his revolver. The knock came again. Soft, deliberate. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. Tom frowned. "That is the knock Nora uses when she comes to buy supplies after hours." Daniel nodded. Tom opened the door. Nora Crane slipped inside like a shadow, a dark shawl over her head, her face pale in the lantern light. She looked at Daniel and then at the map on the table and then back at Daniel. "I know who you are hiding," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a decision that had been made at great cost. "I saw the brand pattern on the bandage cloth you bought. A C shape, burned into the weave from pressing against the wound. I know what that mark means because I have watched my father's men heat the iron." Daniel and Tom exchanged a glance. Nora pulled the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I have known about my father's operation for 3 years. I have known about the people in the mine. I have heard them crying at night when the wind comes from the north. I have seen the wagons arrive in the dark and leave empty. I have done nothing." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I did nothing because he is my father, and because I was afraid, and because I kept telling myself it would stop, that someone else would do something, that I did not have to be the one." She stopped. She was trembling. Daniel waited. "Last week," Nora continued, "a child died in the mine, a boy, 7 years old. My father ordered the body buried outside the shaft. He told his men to dig a hole and put the boy in it and cover it up and forget it ever happened." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was flat and distant, as though she were describing something that had happened to someone else. "The men refused. They said they would work the mine and guard the prisoners and drive the wagons, but they would not bury a child, so I did it. So I dug the grave myself. The ground was hard and the shovel was heavy, and it took me 2 hours. The dirt was still under my fingernails when I sat down to teach school the next morning." The room was very quiet. Tom had his hand over his mouth. Daniel stood still, watching Nora's face, watching the war between love and conscience play out in her eyes. "I rode to Tucson 4 days ago," Nora said. "I told my father I was going to a teachers' meeting in Marana. Instead, I rode straight to the territorial marshal's office. I sat in that office, and I told them everything. I gave them a written testimony. I gave them a map of the mine drawn from memory. I gave them a list of every name I know." She reached inside her shawl and produced a folded piece of paper. She placed it on the table beside the butcher paper map. "This is a copy. The original is with the marshals. They are coming. But they need time to assemble men and supplies. At least a week, maybe more." Daniel picked up the paper and unfolded it. It was a detailed map of the mine, far more complete than anything he and Tom had been able to sketch. Tunnels, chambers, entry points, guard positions, the location of the holding area, even the position of the kerosene stores and the grain warehouse on the west side of the compound. 23 people, Nora said. That is the current count, mostly women and children. 4 guards during the day, 2 at night. The night guards are lazy and drunk by midnight because my father does not inspect after dark. Daniel stared at the map. The gaps were filling in. The plan was taking shape. Why now? He asked. Why not a year ago, 2 years ago? Nora met his eyes, and the pain in them was so raw that Daniel had to look away for a moment. Because a year ago I could still pretend I did not know for certain. 2 years ago I could still believe it might stop on its own. But you cannot pretend after you have dug a grave with your own hands. You cannot unsee the size of that hole. It was so small. Tom cleared his throat. His eyes were wet. Nora, if your father finds out what you have done, then he finds out, she said. I have made my choice. I would rather live with his hatred than keep living with my silence. Daniel looked at Tom. Tom looked at Daniel. Something passed between them. The recognition that they had just been handed the key to Crane's operation by the last person anyone would suspect. But there was a problem. The marshals were at least a week away. Crane was tightening his grip on the territory. Sheriff Boggs was going farm to farm asking questions, and Daniel estimated the man would reach his cabin within 5 days. If Crane discovered that Nora had betrayed him before the marshals arrived, his first move would not be to run. It would be to destroy the evidence. And the evidence was 23 living human beings. They had to act before the net closed. Daniel rode back to the cabin that night with the map in his pocket and a plan forming in his mind. He found Kaya sitting by the fire, awake, waiting. She had not slept. He could see it in her eyes. He spread the map on the table and told her everything. Nora's visit, the marshals coming from Tucson, the window they had to work within. Kaya listened without interrupting. When he finished, she leaned over the map and began adding details he had never seen. The Eastern Canyon Passage, the water source a quarter-mile from the back entrance, the rock formation where a person could hide and watch the guards without being seen. She drew the escape route with her finger, tracing a line through terrain that existed on no white man's map. For the first time, they planned together as equals. His knowledge of tactics and weapons, her knowledge of the land and the mine's interior, his strength, her intelligence. The pieces fit together like halves of a broken thing made whole. They stayed up late into the night, going over the plan again and again, testing its edges, looking for weaknesses. When they finally set the map aside, the fire had burned down to embers, and the desert cold was pressing in. Kaya looked at him across the dying light. "If we die tomorrow," she said. Daniel held her gaze. "Then at least I die for the right thing this time." The silence between them changed. It was no longer the silence of 2 people being careful. It was the silence of 2 people standing at the edge of something they both recognized, but neither had the words for. Kaya reached across the space between them and placed her hand over the scar on his knuckles. The bite mark. The first wound she had ever given him. "I am sorry for this," she said. Daniel looked down at her hand on his. "Do not be. That is how I knew you were a fighter." She leaned forward and pressed her lips against the scar. The touch was light, gentle, deliberate. When she pulled back, her eyes were bright. Daniel raised his hand and touched her face. His fingers were rough and uncertain against her cheek. He wanted to pull her close, and he was terrified of crossing a line she had not drawn. He hesitated. She was the one who closed the distance. She took his hand from her cheek and pulled him toward her and kissed him. Slow, careful, trembling. Not the kiss of a woman being claimed, but the kiss of a woman choosing. Every part of it was voluntary. Every second of it was free. When they separated, neither spoke. They sat together in the last light of the fire, his arm around her shoulders, her head against his chest, and listened to each other breathe. At dawn, Daniel woke to silence. The cabin was empty. The fire was cold. On the table lay the knife he had given her. Beside it, a single desert wildflower, yellow petals, still fresh. He did not understand. He stood in the middle of the cabin, holding the flower, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Then he looked out the window. The second horse was gone. She had left before the plan. She had left to save them alone. And she had left the knife behind because she did not intend to come back. Kaya had escaped this mine once before. Now she was walking back into it. Not running, walking. Because the last time she had saved only herself. This time she would open every door she had closed behind her. The Eastern Canyon passage was exactly as she remembered it. A narrow crack in the rock face, invisible unless you stood at exactly the right angle, wide enough for one person to pass through sideways. The pre-dawn darkness hid her approach. She moved silently, barefoot on the stone, her moccasins tied around her neck to free her feet, for the kind of careful stepping that required skin contact with the ground. She carried no weapons. She had left Daniel's knife on the table because the knife was his gift, and she wanted him to have something of hers in return. The wildflower for hope, the knife for protection. If she did not come back, he would have both, and they would mean what she could not say with words. She was not being reckless, she was being precise. She had scouted the mine on her night ride. She knew the guard rotation, she knew the layout. She knew that between the hours of 3 and 5 in the morning, the 2 night guards were drunk and half asleep around their fire at the main entrance, and the back tunnels were unwatched. She had a window. She intended to use it, but the real reason she went alone was simpler and harder than tactics. She did not want Daniel to die for her. She had lost her mother. She had lost her father. She had lost the 7 women she left behind in the dark. She could not lose another person because of a choice she made. If she was caught, at least he would live. If she freed the others, the risk was hers alone. This was love, she realized, though she did not have a word for it in English. Love was not holding on. Love was making sure the person you cared about survived, even if you did not. She entered the mine through the back passage and moved through the tunnels by memory and touch. The air was cold and damp and smelled of stone and something else underneath, something human and sad. The smell of people kept too long in the dark. She found the holding chamber at the end of the lowest tunnel, a heavy wooden door with an iron bolt. She slid the bolt back. The door swung open on rusted hinges, and the darkness inside shifted and stirred. Eyes. Dozens of eyes, reflecting the faint light from the passage behind her. Women huddled on the bare stone floor. Children curled against their mothers' sides. The old woman, Gray Dove, sat in the far corner with her back against the wall, her white hair loose around her shoulders. "Kaya?" Gray Dove's voice cracked like dry wood. "Is that you? We believed you were dead." "I am not dead," Kaya whispered. "I came back. We are leaving. All of us. Now." She worked the lock on the second chamber with an iron pin she had taken from Daniel's horse corral, a thick nail she had bent and shaped over the course of 2 days while he was not watching. The lock clicked. The door opened. More women, more children. Thin faces, hollow eyes, the smell of sickness and despair. Kaya counted. 21. The number should have been 22. She looked at Gray Dove. "Where is the last one?" Gray Dove's face tightened. "The small one, the girl they brought last. She is in the back chamber. She has the fever. She cannot walk." Kaya's chest constricted. A child, alone in the dark with a fever. She had seen children die of fever in the mine before. The boy whose grave Nora had dug. She closed her eyes and saw his face and heard the silence that followed a child's last breath. She looked at the group assembled before her. 21 people, ready to move, ready to follow her through the Eastern Passage to freedom. She had minutes, not hours. Every second she delayed increased the risk that a guard would wake up or a lantern would swing around a corner and catch them in the light. She could lead the 21 out now, right now, through the passage and into the canyon, and gone before anyone knew. She could save 21 people and lose one child. The math was clean. The logic was sound. It was exactly the choice she had made 6 weeks ago when she drove the bone pin into the guard's neck and ran alone, saving herself while the others stayed behind. It had been the smart choice then. It would be the smart choice now. She could not make it again. "Take the others to the passage," she told Grey Dove. "I showed the entrance to you before. The crack in the rock at the end of the east tunnel. Take them through and wait on the other side." "And you?" "I am going for the child." Grey Dove seized her arm. "Kaya, there is no time. I will make time. Go." She turned and ran deeper into the mine, away from the group, away from the exit, away from safety. The back chamber was 200 yards farther into the mountain, down a narrow side tunnel that dead-ended in a small room used for storage. Crane had put the sick child there to keep the fever from spreading to the others. A practical decision. The kind of decision a man makes when he thinks of people as inventory. Kaya found the girl lying on a pile of sacking in the corner of the chamber. She was small, no older than 6, her body burning with heat. Kaya knelt beside her and felt her forehead and her pulse and listened to her breathing. The fever was high, but not beyond reaching. She needed water and cool cloth and the bark tea that Kaya's mother had taught her to brew. She needed time. Kaya picked the girl up. She weighed almost nothing. The child's head lolled against Kaya's shoulder and a small hand gripped the fabric of her shirt, with the automatic reflex of a child reaching for safety. Kaya turned and started back toward the eastern passage. She was halfway there when the lantern appeared. The light swung around the corner of the main tunnel 20 yards ahead of her, and behind the light came Sheriff Harlan Boggs. He was a big man, soft around the middle, with a red face and small eyes, and a badge that he wore like armor. He had his revolver drawn. He was not smiling. "Well now," Boggs said. "Crane told me you would come back. Said your kind always does. Something about loyalty or stupidity. I forget which one he called it." Kaya stood in the tunnel with the sick child in her arms and felt the walls close in around her. She had no weapon. She had no exit. The passage behind Boggs was the only way out, and he filled it like a cork in a bottle. "Put the child down and put your hands where I can see them," Boggs said. "The child is sick. She needs help. The child is property of the Copper Bluff Mining Company, same as you. Now put her down." Kaya did not put her down. She stood there holding the girl and looked at Boggs with eyes that did not flinch. He shifted his weight uncomfortably. He was a bully and a coward, and he did not know what to do with a woman who was not afraid of him. 2 more men appeared behind Boggs, mine guards. One of them took the child from Kaya's arms, despite her resistance. The other seized her wrists and bound them behind her back with rope, the same kind of rope that had left the scars she already bore. They brought her to Crane's office. It was a room carved into the rock near the mine entrance, furnished with a desk and a chair and a lantern that cast warm light across shelves lined with ledger books. Virgil Crane sat behind the desk in his vest and watch chain, looking as composed as if he were conducting a business meeting instead of holding a woman prisoner in an underground chamber. "Sit down," he said pleasantly. Kaya remained standing. Crane shrugged. "You killed one of my men," he said. "You escaped. You told someone on the outside, and now I have to move everything." He leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Do you understand what you have done? You have not saved anyone. You have made it worse. Every person in that chamber will be moved tonight to a new location, somewhere farther from town, somewhere harder to find. Because of you." Kaya said nothing. She held Crane's gaze and refused to look away. "The cowboy who has been keeping you," Crane continued. "Hayes. I know about him. I know where his cabin is. I know he has been buying medicine and bandaging from my daughter's store. He will be dealt with, along with old Tom Ludlow, who thinks I do not notice when he whispers in corners." He smiled. You see, you did not save anyone. You merely extended the list of people who are going to suffer. He stood and walked to the door. Move the prisoners, all of them, tonight, and put her somewhere she will not be found. He paused in the doorway. The cowboy will come for her. He has that look about him. When he does, finish it. The door closed. The lantern dimmed. Kaya was alone in the dark. She closed her eyes and thought of Daniel. The fire in the cabin, the kiss by the dying embers, the wildflower she had left on the table. She had wanted him to have something alive after she was gone, something that would hold its color for a day or two before the petals fell. She thought about the child in the back chamber, burning with fever, taken from her arms. She thought about Grey Dove leading the others through the eastern passage. Had they made it? Were they out? Or had Boggs caught them too? Then through the stone walls she heard a sound, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Hoofbeats on rock, a single horse riding fast. Only one. Daniel Hayes had given up his badge because he feared what a bullet could do. Tonight he pinned it back on. Not because the fear was gone, but because he was more afraid of losing her than of becoming a killer again. He found the wildflower first, then the knife, then the empty space where the horse had been. He stood in the cabin and felt the world tilt and right itself, and the man who had spent 3 years running from everything he used to be felt something click into place behind his ribs like a round sliding into a chamber. He did not panic. He did not drink. He did not sit down and calculate the odds. He moved. He saddled his horse in the dark with fingers that remembered the buckles even after 3 years of trying to forget. He pinned the old badge inside his vest next to his heart. He loaded the revolver with 6 rounds instead of 5. He put the iron manacles in his saddlebag, the same manacles he had worn on his belt the day he turned in his badge. They had traveled with him across 3 territories like an anchor he could not bring himself to throw away. Tonight, he would use them. He rode to Copper Bluff in the pre-dawn dark and hammered on Tom's back door until the light came on. Tom appeared in his nightshirt with a shotgun in one hand and his wooden leg in the other. Daniel told him what had happened in 6 sentences. Tom dressed in 3 minutes. They found Nora at the schoolhouse where she had been sleeping on a cot since the night she rode to Tucson, too afraid to go home, too determined to leave town. She listened to Daniel's plan, and her face went white and then hard. "I will set the fire," she said. "The grain warehouse on the west side. I know where the kerosene is stored. My father showed me the mine when I was a girl. He was proud of it." The 3 of them stood in the dark behind the schoolhouse and went over the plan one final time. Nora would create the diversion. The fire would draw the guards to the west side. Tom would position himself at the eastern canyon exit with his shotgun covering the escape route. Daniel would enter the mine, find Kaya, and lead whatever captives remained through the eastern passage. "If this goes wrong," Daniel said, "ride for Tucson and bring the marshals back fast." "It is not going to go wrong," Nora said. She said it the way a person says a prayer, not with confidence, with need. They separated. Tom rode east to take his position. Nora slipped through the dark toward the mine compound. Daniel rode north. He reached the mine at midnight. The compound was a cluster of low wooden buildings surrounding the mouth of the main shaft. The grain warehouse stood on the western edge, a long structure with a tin roof that gleamed dull in the starlight. 2 lanterns burned near the main entrance where the night guard sat around a dying fire. Everything was quiet. Daniel dismounted a quarter-mile out and tied his horse to a juniper. He moved on foot, staying low, using the terrain the way Kaya had described it. The rock formation where you could watch without being seen. The dry wash that led to the back tunnels. The crack in the canyon wall that opened into the eastern passage. He waited. The minutes crawled. Then the western sky turned orange. The grain warehouse went up like a torch. The kerosene Nora had spread across the dry timber caught in a rush of heat and light, and within seconds the building was a column of flame that lit the canyon walls and threw wild shadows across the compound. The guards at the main entrance leaped to their feet, shouting. More men poured out of the bunkhouse, pulling on boots, grabbing buckets. The fire roared and crackled, and the whole western side of the compound was chaos and motion. Daniel moved. He entered the mine through the back passage, the narrow crack that Kaya had shown him on the map. The tunnel was dark and close, and he moved by feel, one hand on the wall, his revolver in the other. The sounds of the fire and the shouting faded as he went deeper, replaced by the heavy silence of stone and the drip of water from somewhere above. He found the first guard at the junction of two tunnels. The man was running toward the entrance, drawn by the fire. Daniel stepped out of the shadows and put the barrel of his revolver against the man's chest. "Drop your weapon and walk into that side tunnel and sit down and do not move." The guard looked at Daniel's eyes and dropped his rifle without a word. The second guard was harder. He came around a corner with his gun up, and Daniel had to move fast. He knocked the rifle aside with his forearm and drove his fist into the man's jaw. The guard went down and stayed down. Daniel found the holding chambers empty. Gray Dove had gotten them out. The eastern passage showed signs of recent passage, many feet, moving fast, but one chamber was still occupied. He followed the sound of breathing to a small room at the end of a side tunnel. Kaya was there, bound, sitting on the stone floor with her hands tied behind her back. Beside her, on a pile of sacking, lay a small girl with a fever. Daniel cut the ropes with his knife. Kaya did not cry. She did not speak. She looked at him with eyes that said everything words could not. And then she picked up the child and said, "The others are already out, through the eastern passage. Gray Dove took them. We need to go." "I told you not to come," she added as they moved through the tunnel. "I heard you. I disagreed." The eastern passage opened into the canyon just as the first gray light of dawn touched the rim of the rocks above. Tom was there, crouched behind a boulder with his shotgun, his wooden leg braced against the stone. Beside him, huddled in the shadows, were the 21 people that Gray Dove had led to safety. Women, children, the old woman herself, all silent, all watching with wide eyes. And at the mouth of the canyon, blocking the exit, stood Virgil Crane. He was not alone. Boggs stood to his left with a revolver. 2 hired men flanked him on the right, all armed. The firelight from the burning warehouse played across their faces. Crane spoke first. His voice was calm and measured, the voice of a man who had spent his life bending the world to his will. "Hayes, you know the law here. Sheriff Boggs holds a legal warrant for this woman's arrest. Murder of a mine employee. You are obstructing lawful justice. Step aside and hand her over, and we can settle this like civilized men." Daniel stood between Crane and the group of freed captives. 22 people behind him, 4 armed men in front. The math was bad. He reached into his vest and took out the badge. The tarnished star caught the firelight and threw a small, sharp reflection across the canyon wall. "My name is Daniel Hayes," he said. "Former Deputy United States Marshal. What is happening in that mine is not labor, and it is not justice. It is bondage. Every man standing with you right now is an accessory to it, and every person standing behind me is a witness." Boggs shifted his weight from one foot to the other. The 2 hired guns exchanged a glance. Crane did not blink. "That badge has no authority. You are a deserter." "Maybe so. But the territorial marshals riding here from Tucson carry badges that do. And they will be here before tomorrow night." Crane's composure flickered, a small crack in the mask. He recovered quickly. "You are bluffing." "He is not." The voice came from behind Crane, from the darkness at his back, from a woman who stepped into the firelight holding a pearl-handled revolver that Virgil Crane recognized immediately because it was his own, taken from the locked drawer of his study desk. Nora's face was streaked with soot from the fire she had set. Her dress was singed at the hem. Her hands, wrapped around the grip of her father's gun, were steady as stone. "Put the guns down, Father." Crane turned slowly. The crack in his composure widened into a chasm. "Nora, what are you doing?" "I rode to Tucson. I sat in the territorial marshal's office and I gave them everything. The map, the names, the count, your name. They are assembling riders. They will be here by tomorrow evening. Her voice did not waver. If you shoot anyone in this canyon tonight, you will hang. Not in your own courtroom, where you own the judge. In the open in Tucson, where everyone can see. The word hang echoed off the canyon walls. It was a small word, but it carried the weight of a gallows, and it did what no gun had been able to do. It broke the standoff. Boggs dropped his revolver like it had burned his hand. The badge on his chest suddenly looked very heavy. The two hired men did the math faster than anyone and melted backward into the dark, their footsteps fading on the stone. Crane stood alone. He looked at his daughter, and for one moment the mask fell away completely. And what was underneath was not rage. It was recognition. He had built his empire on silence, on the understanding that no one would speak, on the belief that fear was stronger than conscience. And his own blood had proved him wrong. You would do this to your father, he said. I would do this for those children, Nora said. The way someone should have done it years ago. The way I should have done it years ago. Daniel stepped forward. He took the iron manacles from his saddlebag and held them open. Crane looked at the manacles, and then at Daniel, and then at the canyon full of witnesses, and then at his daughter's steady hands and the gun that bore his own initials on the grip. He held out his wrists. The manacles clicked shut. The sound was small and final, like the closing of a book. Kaya led the freed captives through the eastern passage into the light of a red desert dawn. She walked at the front of a line of 22 people who had forgotten what sunrise looked like. The little girl in her arms stirred and opened her eyes for the first time in days, and whispered a word in Apache that Kaya had not heard in 6 weeks. Outside, the child said, and Kaya held her tighter and walked into the light. 3 weeks after the mine at Copper Bluff was broken open, the town was still talking. But Daniel Hayes, for the first time in 3 years, did not care what anyone said about him. The territorial marshals arrived from Tucson the day after the standoff, just as Nora had promised. A detachment of 6 men on horseback led by a square-jawed captain named Whitfield, who spoke little and listened carefully. They took custody of Virgil Crane and transported him under guard to the territorial prison at Yuma to await trial on charges of involuntary servitude, trafficking, and unlawful imprisonment under the statutes of the Arizona Territory. Sheriff Boggs was stripped of his badge by Captain Whitfield personally, who told the fat man he was lucky he was only losing his job and not his freedom. Boggs left Copper Bluff the next morning on a mule, heading east, and no one watched him go. The 22 freed captives were given aid and shelter at Tom Ludlow's store and the surrounding buildings. Tom, who had spent most of his adult life trying not to get involved in anything more dangerous than a disagreement over flour prices, threw open his doors and his storeroom and his kitchen and fed 22 people for 3 straight days without sleeping. He never complained. He never asked for thanks. He just cooked and carried and cleaned and let the wooden leg thump on the floorboards like a drum beat, marking the rhythm of a man finally doing what he should have done years ago. Some of the freed women chose to return north to their bands. They left in small groups over the following weeks, heading into the mountains toward the summer camps where their families waited. Others, with no band left to return to, stayed near Copper Bluff. Tom helped them find work and shelter. The town, slowly and uncomfortably, began to reckon with the fact that its prosperity had been built on a mine that ran on stolen labor, and that the respectable citizen they had admired for years had been something monstrous hiding in plain sight. Nora Crane became the prosecution's key witness. She would travel to Tucson for the trial and testify against her own father in open court. The town's reaction was split. Some called her brave, some called her Judas. She accepted both titles without argument. She reopened the schoolhouse the week after the mine was broken, and on the first day back she pinned a drawing to the wall beside the chalkboard. It was a picture of the sun, drawn in yellow crayon by a child's hand. Beneath it, in uneven letters, were the words, "Outside." Daniel received a letter from the territorial marshal's office 3 weeks after the events at the mine. It offered him reinstatement. Not as a roving deputy, not as a field marshal, but as a liaison for the protection of native settlements in the Southern Territory. The position was thankless, it was underpaid, it was dangerous. It was exactly what he needed. He sat at his table in the cabin and stared at the badge and the letter for a long time. The badge was still tarnished. The pin was still bent. But it felt different in his hand now. It felt like something worth carrying again. Not because he had earned redemption. Redemption was not a thing you earned once and put on a shelf. Redemption was a daily choice, a series of small decisions that added up to a direction, and the direction mattered more than any single step. He wrote his acceptance. Then he wrote a second letter. This one was harder. He wrote it in pencil on a clean sheet of paper, choosing each word with the care of a man crossing a river on stepping stones. He addressed it to the mother of the Mexican boy he had killed 3 years ago. He told her who he was. He told her what happened on the dirt road that night. He told her about the toy gun and the darkness and the single shot. He told her he was sorry. Not the easy sorry that people say when they want absolution. The hard sorry that comes with no expectation of forgiveness. He told her that her son's face had followed him across 3 territories and 2 years of whiskey, and that it would follow him for the rest of his life. He told her that he was trying, finally, to become someone her son would not be ashamed of. He did not know if she would read it. He did not know if she would care. He sealed the envelope and gave it to Tom to mail, and then he walked outside and stood in the sunlight and breathed. Kaya had left the cabin 4 days after the standoff. She rode north to the temporary camp where the freed women were staying, a collection of tents and shelters on a flat piece of ground near the creek outside town. She spent 3 days there doing what she was born to do. She cleaned wounds that had gone untreated for months. She set bones that had healed crooked in captivity. She brewed bark tea for fever and made poultices for the sores that came from sleeping on stone. She delivered a baby for a young woman who had been too afraid to ask for help, and she held the infant in her hands and watched it draw its first breath in the open air, and felt something break free inside her own chest. Gray Dove found her sitting alone by the creek on the 3rd evening. The old woman sat down beside her and said nothing for a long time. The water ran over the stones, and the evening birds called from the cottonwoods, and the world felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a place where it was possible to rest. "Your mother would be proud," Gray Dove said. Kaya wept. She wept for her mother and for her father, and for the 7 women she had left behind in the mine, and for the boy who had died in the dark, and for the 6 weeks of pain and fear and silence. She wept until there was nothing left, and then she dried her eyes and looked at the sky and felt something new settle into the space the grief had made. She had come back. She had opened the doors. She had carried a child out of the darkness. The guilt that had eaten at her for 6 weeks would never fully disappear, because guilt like that becomes part of you, woven into the fiber of who you are. But it was no longer the only thing she carried. She carried something else now, something lighter, something that felt, when she held it up to the light, like the beginning of peace. On the 4th day, she saddled the horse and tied a small bundle behind the saddle. Everything she owned fit into a single roll of cloth. She rode south. Daniel was repairing the fence line around the cabin when he heard the hoofbeats. He set down the hammer and straightened up and looked toward the canyon trail. The afternoon sun was behind the rider, throwing a long shadow across the packed earth, and he could not see the face. But he knew the way she sat a horse. He had taught her, and she had made it her own, and the combination was unmistakable. Kaya pulled up at the gate. She dismounted and stood there, one hand on the horse's neck, looking at him across the fence he was building. Her hair was loose. Her eyes were clear. The brand on her arm was visible beneath the rolled sleeve of her shirt, and she did not hide it. She wore it the way a soldier wears a scar, as proof of survival. Neither spoke for a long moment. The wind moved through the canyon and stirred the dust between them and carried the smell of sage and something else that might have been rain. Daniel set down the fence post he had been holding. He walked to the gate and opened it wide. Kaya stepped through. Then she stopped and turned to face him. "I am not staying because you saved me," she said. "I know. I am not staying because I owe you anything. I know that too. I am staying because this is the first time in my life I have been allowed to choose where I belong. And I choose here." Daniel looked at her. The late sun was in her hair, and her eyes were steady, and she was the strongest person he had ever known. She was a healer and a warrior, and a woman who had walked into the dark to open doors she did not have to open. She owed him nothing. He owed her everything, and neither of them was keeping score. "I choose here too," he said. She placed her hand over the scar on his knuckles, the bite from the first night, the wound that started everything. He placed his hand over hers. They stood like that for a while, two people in the afternoon light at the edge of the desert, with the gate open and the wind blowing through and the whole wide world available to them. Then Kaya smiled and Daniel smiled, and they walked together into the cabin and closed the door. Not against the world, just for the evening, just for the quiet. Several months later, on a cool morning when the first hint of autumn touched the air, Daniel and Kaya rode together through the same canyon where he had found her. They stopped at the cluster of jagged rocks at the bottom of the slope. The blood was long gone, washed away by summer rains. The rocks were just rocks now. Kaya dismounted. She took a bundle of wild sage and a smooth river stone from her saddlebag and placed them between the stones. She stood for a moment with her head bowed and her hands open at her sides, and she whispered words in Apache that Daniel did not understand, but did not need to. He understood the gesture. He understood. This was the place where one life had ended and another had begun, and she was marking it the way her people had marked such places for longer than anyone could remember. She stood for a long time. Then she turned back to the horse and pulled herself into the saddle. "It is finished," she said. They rode on together. Neither looked back. In Copper Bluff, in the schoolhouse at the end of Main Street, Nora Crane stood at the front of her classroom. The morning light came through the windows and fell across the rows of small desks where children sat with their hands folded. In the front row, a small Apache girl with dark eyes and a shy smile held a yellow crayon in her fist. She was the child from the mine, the one with the fever, the one Kaya had refused to leave behind. Her name, they had learned, was Ilara, and she had been placed with a family in town who treated her as their own. "Who would like to tell a story today?" Nora asked. Ilara raised her hand. "Go ahead, sweetheart." The girl stood up. She clutched the crayon like a talisman and spoke in halting, careful English that she was learning one word at a time. "There was a medicine woman," Ilara said. "She lived in a dark place under the ground. One day she ran away across the desert and she was hurt and she fell down in the rocks. A man found her. He had a star on his chest. She was afraid of him, but he gave her water and food and he did not hurt her. And then she went back to the dark place. She went back because she remembered the children, and the man with the star came after her because he remembered too." The classroom was quiet. The other children listened. Nora listened. The yellow crayon moved in Ilara's hand as though drawing the story in the air. "The medicine woman and the star man opened all the doors," Ilara said. "And the children came out, and the sun was there." She sat down. The classroom was silent for a moment. Then Nora smiled and said, "That was a beautiful story, Ilara." And she meant it with everything she had. Outside the window, the desert wind moved through the canyon, carrying dust and sage, and the faintest sound of hoofbeats heading south, toward the open country, where the land stretched wide and endless and free. Where two people who had once run from the world had finally stopped running, where the gate was open and the door was closed and the evening fire burned warm against the coming dark. There are wounds no medicine can heal and roads no map can draw. But sometimes, in the vast silence of the desert, two lost people find each other. Not because of fate, not because of luck, but because both were brave enough to stop when every instinct told them to run. And that, more than any badge or any blade or any brand burned into skin, is the truest kind of freedom there is. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.